My sense in reading your books is, so there is this censoriousness, or that's something you could be criticized about for. And I'm sure, and you can tell me about that. I'm sure you have been criticized for that. And you've written provocative tracts like The Toxic Cult of Sentimentality, which is a real dagger in some sense. I mean, because people, let's not call it sentimentality for a moment. Let's call it empathy or sympathy. And you make a case that I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that excessive empathy, unthinking sympathy can produce catastrophic consequences because it's not tempered by judgment. And then I look at the personality literature. We have two moral personality traits, roughly speaking. One is agreeableness. And so people who are high in agreeableness are empathetic and sympathetic and self-sacrificing and perhaps resentful because of it. So it's not an untrammeled virtue, whereas the disagreeable types are more likely to be imprisoned. So that's a predictor of antisocial behavior, but they're implacable and stubborn and hard to push around. And so people vary on that distribution. I think agreeableness is the empathy dimension is a trait that's particularly good for fostering the care of infants, because infants, immediate empathy with an infant under 6 to 9 months is almost invariably the right response. If the infant is crying or in distress, your job isn't to question or judge, it's to alleviate the source of the trouble. And it's very hard to take care of infants, and it's no wonder that there's a moral virtue that's essentially devoted to the care of true dependence. But we have conscientiousness too. And conscientiousness is the best predictor of long-term life success apart from IQ. And conscientious people are good at keep formulating and keeping contracts, long-term contracts. It's sort of a cold virtue, and they are judgmental. But as far as I'm concerned, we wouldn't have both these personality traits. Like they're 2 of 5. So it's not like it's a trivial proportion of the variation in personality. We wouldn't have 2 of our 5 personality traits aimed at regulating our behavior if empathy alone was sufficient. And so you go after it, the toxic cult of sentimentality. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, if you like, the infantilization of people who are expressing emotion. So we accept now that I mean, if someone expresses distress, we don't inquire where that distress comes from, how it arose. We just simply try to alleviate it. And, Oscar Wilde, of course, said that sentimentality is the desire to have the emotion without the cost of the emotion. I suppose sentimentality is to empathy what kitsch is to art.
And so what would you regard? Okay, so let's...
I'll give you I start the book with an example, which I read in my local newspaper, which was of a man who bought a chicken in a supermarket and roasted it, and then gave it to they were eating their dinner, and the little girl finds that there are chicken's feet in it and screams with horror. And so the father, the child is so horrified that the father says, I don't know whether this is what he did literally, but I had to throw it out of the window. So he just took the emotion of the child and said, I have to assuage that emotion any way I can, and the quickest way is the best, because of course she would have less emotion if it's dealt with quickly. So there's no attempt to argue rationally about this, that actually chickens do have feet, that they were live creatures once, and this is something that children have to learn. It's one of the things that children have to know.
And so what's the problem with reflexive empathy? Exactly.
Well, it's not exactly empathy, actually.
Okay.
I think it's not genuine
Well,
empathy.
then we should define genuine empathy. We should define genuine empathy and distinguish it from counterproductive sentimentality.
Yeah, well, it's not easy, of course.
No, fair enough. I know I'm putting you on the spot in this. I'm saying that that's something that could be productively attempted.
Yes, I'm not sure I have the complete answer to that.
You're hitting at it from all sorts of different directions, though. Like one of the things that emerges from your book, and I saw you as someone who wanted genuinely to be of help to the people that you were seeing, and tortured by this constant immersion that you had in absolute bloody nightmarish catastrophe, like to a degree that I don't really understand how you managed. Outraged by what you saw, outraged by the thoughtless contribution of skeptical and critical intellectuals to this suffering, which is swept under the table in some sense, or attributed only to, the power-hungry depredations of capitalism or something like that. And so you're outraged by that, and you're trying to use your capacity for judgment to help your clients, your patients, distinguish between those things that they're doing that clearly hurt them and those things that help them, and also to attribute to them the capacity to do that, which, like, I was talking to my wife today. We were talking about a woman she's dealing with who is having a hard time disciplining her 1.5-year-old. And, I mentioned to her that one of the things I've seen among especially my seriously affected clinical clients is that they actually have no idea that they could change their behavior in a manner that would improve the future. That as a concept, that's not part of the subculture that they're embedded in. And that's so counterproductive and unhelpful. Just hinting that's helpful.
We also, of course, give them incentives not to think like that. Because if in fact you have a situation in which changing their behavior will not improve certainly their economic situation very much, which is actually the situation of many of my patients, that takes away one of the possible incentives for changing behavior.
And why is it that finding gainful employment, for example, isn't going to produce a material change in circumstances? How is it that the system, at the level of detail?
Because many people, if they go to work, they lose benefits. They have to start paying for things which were previously paid for them. So they end up going to work for X number of hours and being very slightly better off in monetary terms, which doesn't seem to them to be worth it. And I can understand that. So you're asking them to do low-level job, get up maybe at 6 o'clock in the morning. And furthermore, of course, it's not good for their children because often they are single parents. So they've got no support at home other than whatever it is that the state provides them. And they have to manage their children and going to work when it's very difficult for them.
Right, for no economic incentive.
They're little marginally better off. Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe they have to buy clothes. It's expensive to work to enter the workforce. It's not trivial. They have to arrange transportation. That's also an expense. And then you said childcare. That's a devastating expense because most people who would work on the margins don't make enough money to afford childcare at all, let alone childcare of any quality. Yeah. And so it also means that this unwillingness to pass judgment, let's say, on the part of helpers, also means that we abdicate our responsibility to design social welfare systems that would reward productive behavior because we don't want to make the judgments about what behaviors are productive and what aren't, at least partly because we don't want to make mistakes and throw people out that are deserving, but we can't differentiate. But then because we won't make those judgments, we produce systems that counterproductively reward the kinds of behaviors that produce the problems we want to solve.